The title of this session is, so what is this new thing called slow journalism? And I was tempted to make a comment about this table, which is so slow, the other half of it hasn't arrived yet. As you'll probably notice, journalists are in the minority here on this panel. And that is for a very specific reason, and that is that we all know that journalism is changing rather profoundly right now. And lots of people are trying to figure out what is this next thing that journalism is going to become, because the equation between the people who have traditionally gathered the news and decided what the news is, their relationship with the people who have traditionally received the news or wanted the news is changing. And so there are a lot of people trying to figure out what is this new equation, what is this new relationship that is going on, and what is it actually going to look like. Now that said, most of...
Can you turn your mic off, actually?
Turn it off, okay.
Just speak a little bit louder.
Just speak a little
Yeah,
bit
the mic's causing problems.
Okay.
Belt it.
Belt it. That shouldn't be
Thanks,
such a problem. So the question is, if you're trying to reinvent anything, one of the things that is kind of a rule is that most innovation does not come out of the field which is being innovated. And so we thought that it would be kind of interesting to gather up some people who are thinking in some ways which might apply to journalism, which might have some resonance with whatever this new thing that journalism is going to become. When you say slow journalism, slow is not a word you hear very often in the journalism world. In fact, one of the imperatives of journalism is that you should get it fast and you should get it first. And in some ways, journalism has made a kind of fetish of being first, often at the expense of being right or of giving a kind of complete picture. So there are some interesting kinds of movements that are growing up in other fields, and so we're gonna explore with each of these people some of those ideas. And I've asked them each to get up and talk for 2 or 3 minutes about why it is that they're here, basically, how it is that they relate to this idea of slow. And Josh Viertel here to my right is the first who will go. And he is the first president, right? You're the first of Slow Food USA. Which is a movement that has grown rapidly in the last few years. And before that, he was the co-founder and there for 10 years at the Yale Sustainable Food. 6. Okay. You know, you can't trust websites. So, you want to talk to us a little bit about what the slow food movement is?
Sure. So, I often think about describing what slow food is by asking people this question, which is, if you feel as though in the last 24 hours you've engaged in an agricultural act, you just raise your hand. Chef, what did you do?
I ate strawberries from the market.
Perfect. All right. Great answer.
Provided by Nate.
So 6 years ago when I started doing this work at Yale, I would ask this question because everyone felt like, what does agriculture have to do with higher education or even with sustainability, really? And I'd ask it and no one would raise their hand. Or if they did, there would be an adjunct professor who had a pot with tomatoes in the front. No one was making the connection that because they eat, they're involved in agriculture. I once had a kid in the very back of the hall who would come in late and say, I have this hydroponic thing in my closet. It turned out he actually was growing cilantro, which was pretty great. But yeah, after he realized he had announced this in front of. Now, every time I ask this question, someone raises their hand and says, I ate something. And this stems from this idea that I think originally was articulated by Wendell Berry, who is phenomenal, sort of the poet laureate of agrarian populism in America. And Wendell said, eating is an agricultural act. And I've been thinking about this and thought, well, eating is not just an agricultural act, it's also an act that has implications that are economic, that are social, that are cultural. Every time you eat, there's a story behind that act. And one of the fundamental ideas in slow food, first, is just to be mindful of that story, to be aware of it. And then the second idea that follows is once you're mindful of it, you want it to be a story that doesn't ruin your appetite, right? You want it to be a story that actually you like. So if you ate strawberries from the farmer's market, I'd imagine you had an experience of interacting with the farmer, someone who works at the farm, maybe even talking to them about what they grow, how they do it, or at least just getting this face-to-face interaction. There's pleasure in that in and of itself. So that idea that one, you're aware of the story, and two, it's a story you like. And in slow food, we often talk about the story being good, clean, and fair. And those three words, good, means both that it tastes good, but also that it doesn't make you sick. Clean is it's good for the environment. And fair is it's fair to the people who grow and pick it. It gives them dignity and fair wages. And that also all people can access it. And in fair right now, there's this interesting paradox where food that is good, clean, and fair to the people who grow it is seldom affordable to all people, right? So it's not fair in this other sense. And a big part of our work needs to be to overcome that paradox of fairness in our current food system. Historically, the sustainable food movement has really had these solutions that are only accessible to the people who are hurt the least by our current food system. People who are hurt the most haven't been able to access the kinds of solutions we've posited. And so that needs to change going forward. Does this make sense? So that's a little bit of a background about thinking on slow food. One thing that I think really marks slow food in an interesting way is this link between responsibility and pleasure. So often when we talk about ethics or we talk about environmentalism, we talk about essentially suffering through doing the right thing. Turn the thermostat down. I guess you guys probably don't ever have to do that here, but where I live, it's cold, and we wear more layers and suffer through turning the thermostat down, fly less. Of course, I didn't do that to get here. These things that are kind of suffering moments. When it comes to food, I think there's this wonderful window into responsibility in the environment because pleasure is born of responsibility. So the greatest restaurants, the greatest food, the greatest strawberry comes from a story that is good, clean, and fair. Not just greatest ethically, but greatest in terms of our cultural and gastronomic experience of it. And at the same time, so there's great pleasure in being responsible. There's this responsibility in taking pleasure, which is a wonderful way to kind of recapture pleasure, which can really be aligned with decadence, I think. And instead, it can become something that's more decent and neighborly and simple and good. And thinking about slow journalism, I thought, well, what alignment is there? And one is that there's this story behind food, and that narrative tells something that's really important, but isn't really news. It's not breaking news. And if you look at the way menus have been changing over the last 20 years, you can hardly go anywhere now without hearing some news about the story behind the ingredients. But another way to think of it, I think, is the sort of align model. So slow food was born when a McDonald's opened on the Spanish Steps. And a group of Italians didn't like this. They gathered in Rome and started protesting. But their protest didn't involve pickets. It involved bowls of penne that they handed out to passersby. And so everyone sort of gathered around spontaneously in this beautiful moment. And it was a protest that was born of pleasure. And they started spontaneously chanting, "We don't want fast food, we want slow food." We don't want fast food, we want slow food. And so I'm thinking if we have McDonald's to your farmer's market strawberry, and that's the dichotomy there, is there a sort of Fox News to the best of NPR kind of dichotomy that we could talk about? Or like a, I don't know, maybe even Fox News to Studs Terkel, who did this wonderful way of creating narrative that I think tells real news about our world, but it's not the latest breaking news. Or the StoryCorps project. I don't know if you're familiar with the StoryCorps project, this marvelous project where narratives are gathered through interviews that's very grassroots, modular. It happens essentially on its own. and they're consolidated. Peter.
Very
You just got to
excited.
put it together. So is there some sort of parallel movement towards a different kind of narrative and sharing information? So those are my thoughts.
Thank you. The earliest reference I found when I was researching for this panel to slow journalism was an article in Prospect magazine in February of '07. And Susan Greenberg, who's a lecturer at Roehampton University, coined the phrase. And she defined slow journalism as something, essays, reportage, and other nonfiction writing that takes time to find things out, notice stories that others miss, and communicate it all to the highest standards. That was her idea of slow journalism. To go in a little bit different direction, Mister Jalopy here is somebody who, as the New York Times refers to him as prophet of the maker movement, and he wrote the Makers' Bill of Rights. And he's been talking a lot about the relationship between people who make things and people who use things. Corporations who make things, and the relationship that they have with the people who will ultimately use them. And you want to talk a little bit about that
Sure.
relationship?
So who knows Make Magazine? Have you heard of Make Magazine? Okay, so a few people. Make Magazine's starting in its 4th year. It has a sister publication called Craft. Make has 120,000 paid circulation. It's run out of Sebastopol. Make and Craft Magazine, along with Maker Fair and Maker Media of all the books, is run by 16 people, with, of course, a lot of help to scale up at the time. And the idea of Make is technology that we can touch, that we are engaged in meaningful ways, and that we can change it and mold this stuff to what it is that is the stuff of our dreams rather than what people are trying to sell to us. I've been writing for Make since, I'm just a freelancer. And, I'm not a journalist. I've not been to school for journalism. I've not been to school for anything. But I write for a Make, and I build the objects of my dreams. This is my mobile drive-in urban guerrilla movie theater. It's made out of some bookshelves, a kitchen table that I found by the side of the road, a lot of flattened tin cans, a 15-inch PC LCD monitor, a very bright light bulb, and a handful of lenses. And it makes a projection 12 feet diagonal. And it came from, I missed drive-in movie theaters, and rather than moaning and groaning about it, I built my own drive-in movie theater to share that experience with my friends and my family. Can you go to, this is me in my shop. This is one of the fellows took this recently. I have a shop in LA. And what else? So I wrote the Maker's Bill of Rights, and this came out of an event of, I was trying to fix my Chevy truck. I went to buy a new fuel, or the fuel gauge stopped working correctly. And there's a little tiny metal tang in there that had broken on a removable part of the fuel sender. But instead of buying that piece, that small component, I had to buy the entire pump assembly, even though it was obviously clear that I could take it off and replace just that piece. And it was $600 for the whole assembly. And I realized that we didn't have an honorable dialogue between company and consumer, that I had given up this fundamental part of ownership, that they were still controlling it. And it wasn't mine. It's still Chevy's, it's still Apple's, it's still Sony's. And I want to break that bond. So I wrote a lot about the Maker's Bill of Rights and talked to a lot of makers, and everybody gets it, and it makes sense. And it's things like screws are better than glues. You should be able to open it with screws, not have to break it open. And that we should be able to buy replacement parts at a modular, reasonable level. And of course, the big reason for this is longer lifespans. So let's see. So the headline for it was, "If you can't open it, you don't own it." And I think that that's all you need to say. Made it onto the T-shirt. And then I build these contraptions, and what happens is if companies companies can choose to collaborate with people, like Scion has reached out to the community and collaborated. Or they can just make their products open enough that we're able to collaborate with them without their knowing that we're even doing it. And what they get out of this, besides the fact that they're not jerks, is they get people innovating outside of their core. They get to go places that they would never be able to go individually. This is this is the world's largest iPod. It's made up of a whole lot of different components, and it's all encased in a 40s radio console. The original buttons work the iPod. It digitizes records, and it works really great. It's the stereo in my shop every day. What's the next slide? What else do I have? That's it? Okay, so that's it. So that's kind of what I do, and so what I'm spending a lot of time on these days is to try and talk to companies however I can, either through talking to you guys and talking to media and talking to companies directly about how this isn't a scary thing and that there are building blocks of engagement. It's not like they have to decide overnight, okay, we're going to be completely open and the walls are going to come down and we're going to engage. Instead, there are all these different ways that they can engage in sharing information and making parts available and just kind of wade into it and see how it goes. I come from the music industry, and I saw what happened to the music industry very starkly. And I quit when I saw it happening. I worked with all the people at the time that Napster was eating our lunch. And the problem was they were afraid to let go of it completely. And in talking to people from EFF and stuff, which is the Electronic Frontier Foundation, I said, you need to give them an honorable path back if it doesn't work. Because once they open it up, if it all goes kablooey, they're on the hook for fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. And you need to give them a way to do it. So what I work with companies and what I'm trying to get across is that it doesn't have to be this huge binary, that we can just take these small steps together and get there. The reason I'm here is because Sasha asked me to, and I do whatever she says. I think a lot about this, of how it works with different businesses. I gave this talk last week to a school, and the Dean of Arts and Letters, this was at a community college of 22,000 people. He said afterwards, instead of us telling students what classes we're going to offer, I'm going to ask students to make up what they want. And we're going to start working backwards. And I talked to him a week later, and I said, so are you changing everything? He said, we're changing everything. We're going to engage in this way. So it makes sense to people with these kind of examples. And instead of me thinking about slow journalism, I mean, what Doug's saying of that definition, it makes sense. Do a good job, right? Spend the time, do the best job that you can. People will value that good job. That makes sense. I think that there's this other level, though, which is engaged journalism. That just as I talk to companies that are, stop thinking about your innovation stopping at the end of the assembly line. Think about that's the point that you're handing it off to your collaborators. And what are you doing to empower them for those next steps? And I think that, I personally don't think that there has been the disruptive force yet in journalism. I think that there's a disruptive force in classified advertising. I think that there's things like that. But I don't think that there's been a disruptive force yet as big as what, say, TV would be. And because if you look at how the news is disseminated online, it's all the same players that have already been doing it. There's going to be a disruptive force that's going to empower people to connect with news in an incredibly engaged way. And when I think of slow food, I don't think about the tomato. I think about the chain of engagement, of being able to work with all these people down the way. And I think that this can be the same thing with journalism, that the piece doesn't die. You just hand it off to the collaborators, and it kind of lives forever. That's my piece on it.
Actually, David Lee, who's a writer for The Guardian, had something interesting to say about this idea of the collaborator, of people who actually work at it, bringing the news to people. And he said, this is in November of 07 last year, just about a year ago. He said, slow journalism would show greater respect for the craft of the reporter, a patient assembler of facts, a skilled tradesman who is independent and professionally reputable, and who can get paid the rate for the job. A disentangler of lies and weasel words. I love the last part. I don't think that any of these ideas are necessarily new, and I think that Mr. Jalopy says, it's basically talking about quality and what is the traditional sense of what quality is. Next up, we have Peter Sellars, the theater director who has made something of a career of challenging the relationship between audience and artists. And he also teaches a couple of interesting classes at UCLA, art as social action and art as moral action. So maybe you could build on what Peter just said.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. It's great to see everybody. It's with a pleasure as who's in the room. My God, there's a lot of pleasure in this room. It's beautiful to see people this morning. Let's free associate, which is the reason we're here. I would just throw into the cooking pot a couple of simple things. One is my work as an artist is whatever it is, but a lot of what I do is not about my work and is actually about other people's work. What interests me more than my own trajectory is at a given moment in time there's a movement. It's not just this artist's work, it's that artist's work, that artist's work, and you begin to look around and you begin to recognize that we're far less alone than has been advertised. But we just don't know who's doing what. And obviously journalism went into a place where the only thing you have space for is another interview with Tom Cruise, which, the only people we're allowed to know are people we already know too well. And we're not allowed to meet anybody new, because if we don't already know their names, then we can't cover them. And that kind of thinking, which obviously has mushroomed into the bloated and collapsing corporate universe, that is just going the way of the dinosaurs at this particular moment. And the idea, of course, of the internet and the idea of slow food are related, and it's been spoken of. It's reciprocity. It's actually a rather old idea of human relations, and it's if you have more communication going in one way than the other in your relationship, you may have a problem. And how to even the flow of relationship, and even the flow of communication, even the flow of interaction. Obviously, both journalism and the cultural world come from a problem, which is a kind of imperialist ancestors, and they've never really quite shaken the top-down hierarchy and the sense that my word is more important than your word, and this kind of nightmare of empire building that is reproduced exactly in an opera house and an art museum in these top-down authoritarian structures, which would not prepare anyone for democracy. And it's one of the crises right now that when we need democratic art, most artists are underprepared to actually put forward democracy as an artistic project and as a social experience. And so really reformulating some of the kind of structural conditions under which we're working and trying to create things that actually are more engaged with the question of equality, which is the great promise of this country that we're living. The country promised equality. How do you achieve that? How do you touch that? What is the eye of equality, as the Bhagavad Gita would say, versus what we have now all around us, the evil eye. Now, the evil eye, I just can't resist because we're all journalists. The evil eye, every culture knows what that is. And that is, very specifically, Jesus says, if you look at somebody and say, that fool, you will burn in hell forever because you have worse than murdered them. To actually take a knife would be redundant. The act of violence has already occurred in the eye and in the mind. And we're living in an extremely violent period where the evil eye is covering everything. And we're receiving news from this kind of evil eye of people who've just reported on Darfur and just made it back to the Intercontinental in time for a steak dinner before the kitchen closed. And why are these video images so weirdly sterile coming to us from the center of Africa? What is into the sterility of the image that is showing us despair and catastrophe and blah, 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 but in an unbelievably sterile manner? in which we are spectators, not participants. And what does it mean to insist, which is the point of slow food and what people who are part of CSAs know, right? Which is you enter into a group in your community, enters into a commercial and also larger than commercial relationship with a farm, and you go and help out on the farm, and your things are delivered directly from the farm every month, and you have a relationship with the people growing the food, with the earth itself in which the food is grown, and you're not producers and consumers, you are co-producers. And we are actually all co-producers. And we actually have the responsibility for everything we consume, which means that we've coming through a system, journalistically and in terms of the way things are marketed, where what is marketed is the product. And everything's about this product, and you don't need to know who picked it. You don't need to know what pesticides were sprayed on them and why they can't have children. And you don't know that why your strawberry doesn't only taste a little bitter, but in fact is filled with poison karma. And the West's high standard of living, is based on so much violence, which is why, we live better than anyone, we have every luxury on earth, and why most people are in therapy. The strange thing is that this high standard of living has failed to bring good karma with it because there's so much bad karma in the process of sustaining it. So what does it mean to unpack all of that, which is what slow food is about, and to put producers and consumers into relation again? And a relation that's not only reciprocal but responsible, engaged, and creates pleasure, but also an ethical shared practice. That it's ethical to consume a certain way, and it's ethical to produce a certain way. And those ethics are really, really part of what we talk about in terms of cultivation. And this is, for me, why I'm interested in culture and agriculture together. And to deal with the fact that most cultural systems actually came out of agricultural societies and responses. And that, in fact, the more we distance ourselves from that, the more we're missing the point. And what it means, obviously there are certain artists, this morning Mark Morris pirouettes to mind, of just Mark Morris, for example, creates dances with his company where the dancers dance for each other. And their pleasure is intoxicating because the pleasure is shared. Versus the Royal Ballet, which is dancing for you, and the dancers are ignoring each other and pointed entirely at the audience with this kind of nightmare smile on their face that makes you really dizzy with unhappiness. And the sense of, worst case scenario, if my grandmother's old thing, company is coming, we all have to begin to act incredibly unnaturally. And there's part of that nightmare of the arts. Or there is, what does it take to actually create and maintain shared spaces? And to me, this is the project of the 21st century, is how do we share the planet? And how many interesting ways can we share? What is the act of sharing? What is the act of sustaining the act of sharing? And if I could really just say, again, simply, I'm sorry going on a little long here, but three images. One, obviously, is the Greeks in their 10 minutes in which democracy prevailed in Athens. They created theater as a way of sustaining democracy. And it was understood that democracy needs to be sustained and maintained by culture. And so this question of sustaining and maintaining roots, rootedness, and a shared rootedness, and insisting on planting something that is actually becomes a communal space and harvesting it together. Those are very, very powerful images for me for journalism and also for the practice of the arts. Because as journalists, Sasha knows one of my big obsessions, I taught at the Berkeley School of Journalism for a couple of years just because my obsession was, as artists and as journalists, we are the ones responsible for communication in this society. And how are people voting? What do they think? It's shocking to see how Americans vote, and to see the propositions that won in the state of California is just a nightmare. And we're the ones providing the information. So where are we in this? We're the way people get their information. Now, when I say information, again, I'm trying to get beyond the sterility of, first of all, the pretense of objectivity. which is a serious, serious problem, where the newspaper says we're completely objective, and then says, finally, a week before the election, our choice is Obama. We're like, come on, get over it. We need to have much more interestingly nuanced ways of dealing with our connections. And for me, one of the most important things for journalists in my line of work is that the journalists are at rehearsal and are part of the process, and that we're actually are sharing a space that's informed and mutually informed and part of a discussion, and not the kind of sterile discussion of once we're all done talking about it, but actually once we're making it, talking about it. And actually that the way it's written about is part of the way it's being made. And the way it's being made is a response to also how it's being written. And that these things are in a flow through, rather than, again, in this nightmare end of the factory assembly line, and now we can analyze the product. No. In fact, we're all engaged in making something that is, again, like agriculture, living. It's alive. It's not an object. It's not a dead thing. It is a living being. Everything we're making as artists. And so how we begin to, again, shift out of treating people and other things as objects and beginning to realize that nothing is an object. Or as Josh said, everything you put in your mouth, everything you're wearing has a story. Your underwear is made in Bangladesh or Honduras or some nightmare place where people are, like the bad karma of it is touching your body at this moment. It's ongoing. It's not finished. It's ongoing. These things have lives, and we're living them. And so this sense of not treating anything as an object, but treating everything as a story. And once you make a story out of everything, and once you realize the story has its ethics, it also has its magic. It has its surprise. It has its transformation. And in fact, everything we can do is transformational. And it's understanding where the transformational energy of the story is, which is the act of the artist and the act of the journalist. Is at some place in this story, there's a transformational energy. Can, as an artist and as a journalist, we access that moment so that the story you write and the film or the production that I make are not the last word. In fact, what we've done is to create an open and shared space as a result. And so there's much more to come.
And Naka Nathaniel is a multimedia journalist for the New York Times.com, was, and has for several years been thinking about different ways of telling stories in a variety of settings all over the world. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure thing. Actually, mine, penny at the bottom of the Spanish Steps was this. This is, we moved to Los Angeles in January, middle of last year, and we were moving back from Paris, and lo and behold, we weren't the biggest stars coming from Europe at that point in time. This was the time when David Beckham appeared at down at the Home Depot. It's very rare that I clip something out. It's very, very rare that I laminate something. But I ended up going through, and I counted just in this photo alone, there are 38 cameras, 38 high-end cameras. Now this is for a sport that nobody in America cares about, and this was just such an eye-opener for me. And then I had to do it myself. I was back in New York back in December, and I was just wandering into the newsroom, and the editor saw me and said, "Hey, what are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm going over this way." He says, "No, you're not. You're grabbing your camera and you're going over to the Marriott, and you're going to go, do the Mitchell Report, which is this baseball steroid thing." Which again is like, give me a break. It's baseball. And my attitude for that was because for the last 5 years I've had as a journalist, the good fortune to be able to go around and start covering stories that matter. And yeah. And so Yeah, I don't know how many of you are familiar with my favorite newspaper section. Sadly, it's not the New York Times. It's actually the Life and Arts section from the FT. Does anybody else here read this? Thank God. I want everybody to be reading this. It's great. But on the back page, very controversial character, Tyler Goulet, who's up in the upper left-hand corner. And his title is My Search for the Perfect Man Bag. This is the guy who did wallpaper. And he was also, beforehand, he had done a lot of, he was great doing some nice work for the BBC. In fact, he got shot in doing stories on Pakistan and Afghanistan. And subsequently went on to go do wallpaper. But, so he was kind of like the guy I would pay attention to. At one point, I needed to have the perfect man bag, so I would go to Tyler Goulet. But eventually, I've kind of shifted over now to the, Tyler Goulet writes the fast lane, and Harry Ayres over here writes the slow lane. And it's about just appreciating life. He likes to go off for swims in this, the pond in Hempstead and stuff like that. He's writing about something called the Alexander technique in, doing the mind-body stuff. And it's something that, I find roots in where we're going. But in reality, the roots go back even further. And this is, I had the great pleasure of working with a great columnist named Nick Kristof. And he and I basically traveled around the world for the past 5 years. We first met in Kuwait for the Iraq War during the invasion. And it was only natural that we ended up teaming up because as we found out during introductions that in Arabic, our names we're meant to be together because in Arabic, his name, Nick, means fuck, and Naka means fucked. So, that fucking fuck going to go travel around the world so here we are. This is one of our first trips together. We went up to Annenberg to actually see what Gail Norton, the Interior Secretary at the time, had called a great piece of nothing on the top of the world. So we actually went up there to go see what was going on, and that kind of started us off on this entire line of journalism that almost all of the journalists, if you ask them, that's what they really want to be doing. It's the sort of coverage that we were doing about food, sex slavery, you name it. One of those issues that people just don't take a chance. And that's what it was, is that we were I had the only camera for thousands of miles, and the idea of this, as you were saying, Tom Cruise, not introducing new characters to what we should be talking about, it became a very, very important thing to me. But in reality, I think this is maybe the first time I've talked about slow journalism sober. The roots in this, for me, go back to, as I mentioned, I've been living in Paris for the past 5 years. My wife is, and the reason why we're here is my wife is the executive editor of LATimes.com. LATimes.com. And before we were living in Paris, she was working for the IHT, and I was based in New York, based in Paris for the New York Times, and traveling around all over the place. But when we got there, it was so nice to just disconnect from New York. And part of my French lesson every day was I would watch Joel Robuchon. He would do a little 20-minute show, and do a nice little suit teacher, subcaptions, captions underneath. And I would watch that, and I would try and make later on that afternoon, the dish that he had on there. So it was always great going off to the markets, and then, I would meet Meredith at the over in the Bois of Bologna, and we would sit next to the lake, and we would start having these great discussions like you're supposed to do, contemplating all of life's things. Well, this was back in after I got back from Iraq in 2003, when the entire Jason Blair stuff started going on in the New York Times, and I had been friends with Jason. We hung out, kind of drinking thing, and the rest of that stuff. And one of the things that really shocked me when stuff started coming back was the family in West Virginia, the Lynch family, said, "Why didn't you say something?" And they said, we just expected that's the way it was. And so, since I had come up from the same programs as Jason, both went through the internship program, the rest of that stuff, it really, it hit me going like, we got to do better. We got to fix some of this stuff that was going on. So fortunately, Nick was great to work with. I would throw out an idea. He's one of the greatest writers of our age, but but he was so open to new ideas, and for me, experimenting, using his brand name, and me kind of doing my best to ruin that brand name with different things. So we tried to do a lot of audience engagement things, and came up with, for instance, after one of our trips to Darfur, I got him to dump all the notes. I took all of our photos, all of our images, and put them onto the web. And we invited people to take a crack at our source material. We were under deadline pressure to tell our story. There's a million different ways to do things. So we threw it all out to everybody and said, hey, please, we just took this one snippet. Nick had 800 words. I had, 3.5 minutes for my video and the different blog posts and everything else like that. Take a crack at it and see what you come up with. It can be a song, it can be a map, it can be a story. And what ended up, we held a contest, and the winner ended up writing a fictional letter using one of our characters. And it's really, really powerful and moving, and it ended up being turned into a play, and it goes on and on and on. And so that's what we were trying to get people to actually get into the game. And we also wanted something that was smaller. The one of the great things, has anybody ever read the IHT? Picked it up while you were overseas?
Yeah.
It makes you feel so good because you can read it while you're drinking your coffee. 1 cup of coffee. It doesn't take, the better part of 2.5 hours to read the New York Times, for instance, and you walk away feeling good about what you've read, and you recall all this stuff. And so that's one of the things that Meredith and I have always talked about. It's like, what if you could strip this stuff down, make it really, really simple, on one thing that really matters. And so that's kind of where we are with the slow journalism. This slide that I threw up, in one of the classes that Sasha was teaching. So I don't know what it is exactly. I mean, part of the stuff is like taking, slowing things down, making quality stuff, but then also the local angle of trying to, what happens when your audience gets the opportunity to react to what you've just written about them, and then people start to get involved and start, you just keep things in one place, and you don't always have to jump off to the next soccer star that pops up in the United States. So that's the thing, is that I hope that more people, like I said, the movements. Like, I want this movement to take off, because I found a way of kind of consuming this information to be so rewarding. The audience interaction has been amazing. It's nothing better, and I just wish that more journalists, were able to disconnect from the, constant updates. Got to beat somebody. Hey, elbow your way in, to find a good spot to get the shot, and that's why I should more people start, get fired up with this stuff.
How does something like the Darfur data dump and the interaction with the audience, how does that then change how you approach the next thing you do, or what you decide to do?
You just start gathering more and more material, and you realize that you're not going to produce the finished product, that you're going to be the first source material, and it leads you to make to be a little more open-minded, I think, in gathering stuff. Like, hey, what about this? It's kind of the open source stuff where you just kind of throw everything out there, let somebody else find what's important, and then start filling up that.
Is thinking this way harder?
Yes.
In what way?
Nobody's thought this way before. Nobody's thought to do it this way. Because, well, and also the other part too is that, we were also kind of working in our own little space doing this experimenting, by the way, because it was under time select, which is why many of you may have never heard of this thing. So, nobody was paying attention. I mean, we went from having, potential audience of millions upon millions to an audience of, 10,000 people looking at things. And so that was part of it, is that you got to throw the rule count.
But on the other hand, if you involve the audience and the audience starts creating things around what you're doing, as you described, doesn't that, in a way, make it easier? I mean, it's not like you're abdicating responsibility, but by letting something go and making it an interaction, it's not all incumbent on you to be creating something all the time.
Right. I mean, and this is one of the nice things that, it's all nothing to try to think of comparisons, like the balance, the work-life balance that goes into the movie. It's like we didn't have to sit on top of the story the entire time. You could walk away, you could go off and, move on to the next thing while the audience catered this and started playing around with it.
Hey Naka, can you talk a little louder?
Sure.
Beautiful. Thank
All right,
you.
better? Okay.
Oh yeah.
So that's the nice thing, where you get like the maker, where you're able just to pull the cover off and start, hey, maybe a slide would be a much better way. And that was the other thing too, is that, you know, a print newspaper is very, very defined. You know, you have a certain number of column inches. You know, Nick was restrained to 800 words twice a week. That's it. But we knew we could fill so much more, or we could come up with a different way. So, and that's the nice thing, where you get away from the rules, the way that's always been done, and open it up to people who have different talents. Like, hey, I can, you know, I'll paint. You know, I'll do a painting. I'll write a song or something. You know, people submitted MP3s on this thing. I'm not the world's greatest music critic. I should have said that to you, but you know, it wasn't. You know, it wasn't. It didn't really strike the chord. Or it did strike the chord, but yeah, in a different world for me.
So I have this notion, Peter, that artists are, in effect, already practicing slow journalism. That artists, the thing about artists is that they're trying to create some action or reaction or interpretation or experience about something that is true for them. And that in what Naka just described is almost an artistic response to something. And is journalism then moving towards more of a kind of artistic act, do you think?
Well, I mean, the exchange that we always pray for is that artists would learn from journalists to know what they're talking about, and that journalists would learn from artists to actually take that plunge into a very personal engagement with the material, and also let your own biography be part of the picture, because it is. You know, and again, for me, the nightmare is the assumption of some kind of place where you're untouchable, and it's in fact the opposite. What's so bizarre is, particularly if you're somebody we read a lot, we know everything about you, and it's ridiculous to think you can cover it up. And it's much better to actually put it forward, because that gives us all a place to engage. And so for me, it's all of our fantasies of omnipotence, because obviously journalism has a weird power thing engaged with it, and some of that needs to be detoxed every morning, and some of that needs to be encouraged in a cool way. You know, same as being an artist. You know, you have to actually realize you're not a genius, and B, you're just as good as everyone else in the room, and C, you're the only person who has permission to say what you're thinking, and to act from your conscience. Because most other people every day go to work and do something they don't believe in, or they know is wrong, or you know, something, but it's their job, they have to do it, and no one's going to ask them what they think. And we are some of the few people who are actually paid to respond, to say what we think, to see what we see, and to say what we see. And that act is empowering not just for ourselves, but for other people. And for me, it's an interesting, I like the shared frontier of journalism and the arts, because again, the most memorable stories are when journalists really go in there and become part of the story in a very, not Hemingway sense, but actually much more, what can we do? And for me, the hope of the internet is that finally you can actually email back, what do you need? And be part of engaging with people who are in whatever the situation is. You know, and so we're no longer spectators for the news. And obviously the whole spectator culture that was created, that we've just come through, and as I said, that is collapsing spectacularly now, is going to have to give way to the participant observer, you know, which physics has known for a long time, and just say, okay, where are we all in this picture? Find yourself in this picture. Find your grandmother in this picture. You know, that's what we do as artists. And, you know, find yourself in those shoes. And then use that in a reciprocal way. Because for me, again, it's not just, a lot of our journalistic focus is to all go to Darfur. But obviously, there's a whole bunch of stuff in Darfur that would help you in East LA. You know, and that we're being totally dishonest about East LA. And we're not speaking about East LA in the way we're happy to speak about Darfur. You know, and obviously 800 kids are shot every year in East LA. You know, it's serious. And the roots of the violence are more than what's being reported. and what is being used by really nightmarish, opportunistic politicians. You know, and we have our own full-blown crisis, quote unquote, if you want to handle life as a series of crises, which is not also attractive to me. And a pity that that's the only thing we're able to use to say there's now a story, because it's a crisis. Can we create something that lets Darfur re-illumine Los Angeles and lets what we know from doing real work here in Los Angeles help out in Darfur? You know, to me, those are now to get out of the exoticism of here and there, to actually, again, say, well, it's one planet. In fact, we're dealing with these issues here and here. In fact, the same questions are, you know, of that strawberry, you know, are moving in China at this moment. The same, so could we begin to talk about these things in more holistic ways and less glamorized distances, and actually begin to deal with the realities, which are shared and will be shared by all of us?
So I can see all sorts of problems with that.
Uh-huh.
I mean,
Yeah.
completely am sympathetic with this, but when you start to talk about realities, so it's one person's reality is different from another person's.
Okay, could I just say one thing right there? Just because I know I'm going down a dangerous place, I just want to please emphasize at the start, and people who know my productions know, my obsession is not to play a zero-sum game or not to say all or nothing.
Right.
But what's so interesting is all these tiered levels moving at once. Is that if things are existing on multiple levels, I teach in a program at UCLA called World Arts and Cultures. And the most important thing about that sentence is the plural of everything. You know, is that it is plural. There is no singular. Is that you actually are recognizing multiple realities moving. You're recognizing multiple cultures converging. You're seeing multiple historical arcs converging. Everything is multiple. And if we can get out of the singular storytelling mode, that would help everyone a lot. And begin to be more comfortable with multiplicity as the given. You know, and that is both energizing and challenging for both the reader and the writer. You know, and to me, makes everything alive.
Well, in the spirit of the participant observer, I'd like to throw this open to everybody and for comments, but also to make it a more interactive experience. So if you want to direct comments to somebody and get a reaction, that's fine. But it's also okay to make a comment and just move the conversation along.
Well, what strikes me after hearing everybody in the panel is just hearing what their philosophies are, and then witnessing the coverage of the fires here in Southern California. Being from the Midwest, I never experienced this like on a 24/7 basis. It just like seems like it's the same story over and over again. It's like, oh, it's horrible, blah blah blah, and it's just like these people in front of cameras, just like reciting the obvious. And we're wondering what the panel would do in terms of trying to cover this issue a little more innovatively, or just nailing it, or just it's just so reactive. And they're not really looking at it in a larger context. It's just like sensationalism because of what the eyes on the image right now.
If fire was invisible, there wouldn't be any coverage. But because it's bright and orange, there's a lot of coverage.
It's very, very true, and it's something I had to live with it this weekend. Erica's running the site, and so they're always on the phone and doing all this stuff. And you're right with the drops. Those airdrops are CNN drops. I mean, they're nonsense. It's a complete waste of resources. When the economists are going to go back through, and you'll see these stories that are going to pop up in January. LA Times did a huge series on this in reaction to last year's fires. These things are all nonsense. And that's what it comes down. And somebody asked me the other night, it's like, so what's the public service angle on it? And she immediately was like, and that's when they've gotten better about it. And it's not to pick on the TV stations, but okay, well, yeah, TV stations. But that's what they do. I mean, that's their the reporter doing a gratuitous stand up, with the bottles and the masks. I mean, that's much better way to cover this stuff. And I think the websites are starting to figure this out. Use your Google business. use the information points, see where the stuff is going, which way is the fire going, what are the resources and stuff, and try and make it actually useful, for folks. Unfortunately, most of those people are cut off anyways from the computers and mobile devices. There would be another answer to that. That's the next iteration.
I had this experience traveling in Spain where it snowed, in this region where it doesn't snow. And it shut down the roads. And on the news, there was this woman standing in front of a snowplow saying, "This strange device behind me, pushes the snow with its giant shovel." And I had sort of the same experience you did. That this is so strange. This is, one, it's not a story, and two, I'm from the Northeast, it's not even a snowstorm. And thinking about how we could share information that actually helps overcome problems. There was this great project it was in Estonia, I think. Clean Up Estonia.
Oh, yeah.
I think maybe 19 or 20-year-old woman used Google Maps and satellite imagery to find all of the illegal dumps in Estonia. Took a lot of prep time, created a network of people who cared about it, and then in one day, they cleaned the entire country.
10,000 people cleaned up all the trash in Estonia on one Monday morning in 5 hours.
And so when we talk about what's the role of this decentralized, how can we decentralize news? It's not just to feel more populist.
Well, just to say two more things about that project, because she also had this, because why the trash accumulated. She talked about what it means when in your own apartment you just let stuff accumulate, what it means that you no longer pick up, what it means that you just use the place you live as a dump, and the kind of moral decline while Estonia was an occupied country, and this question of people not even thinking of it as their own country anymore, this kind of strange distancing, and what kind of depression it speaks to when you actually foul your own nest, and what that means just in your own life when you just don't do the dishes for a week. What's going on? So anyway, maybe I could also add to that one more fire story, since it's the story that didn't particularly get told, which is obviously in 1992 when the city of Los Angeles was burning. The people who set those fires after the Rodney King verdict came out, the stories that were not told, was because there is a story behind the story, obviously, which is the point of most stories, and that's one thing I would say we do as artists is not the story, but the story behind the story, and then the story behind that, because that's where it gets interesting. Because the story itself is usually, like most official stories, made up for horrifying purposes, and you need to move a few stories back to get to something that actually has a genuine taste to it. Just to say it really, really quickly, the national story that was not reported was 3 weeks to the day before the Rodney King verdict came out. First of all, the black population of Los Angeles did not riot when the Rodney King video was shown, and the person being beaten 50 times by helpless person being beaten. Finally, there were no riots in the streets. They said, okay, here is the evidence of the brutality that we have claimed for years. Finally, it can go through court. It's now as an evidence. Let the justice system take its course at last. So there were no riots. 3 weeks before the Rodney King verdict came out, we started executing people again in the state of California, which served notice, of course. Most people on death row are African American. And so that was the first signal. The week before the Natasha Harlan's verdict came through, which was a liberal judge in a community hoping to make a healing gesture. A 13-year-old African-American girl was involved in a scuffle, argument over a $1.35 bottle of orange juice with the Korean lady who ran one of the stores in South Central Los Angeles, convenience stores. The Korean lady was freaked out and reached behind the counter for a gun and shot this girl, who died immediately. And the surveillance video from the store is available. You can see what it is. It's a kind of misunderstanding, but it's also fear. I mean, fear, enormous fear. The sentence given to this, the Korean shopkeeper, was 100 hours of community service. So the black community had again been told that the life of a black person is worth nothing, and obviously if it had been reversed, the racial configuration, that person would be serving life without possibly parole, blah, 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 blah. So then, 1 week later, the Rodney King verdict came out, acquitting these white police officers of what we had all seen on a pretty unmistakable video. Then the city was lit on fire. And the city was lit on fire over the next week in a highly organized way. In fact, a lot of the gang members who are frequently talked down to as non-human, of course they're human, and actually many of them are very smart, and many of them are making money in the only way that's available to them. And they would have Harvard MBA degrees, if it was available to them. These are given what they have, they're making a lot out of it. And they're highly organized and not uneducated and very intent on educating themselves. One of the things they did was create a map in fire of economics of South Central Los Angeles. And they drew a map of a ghetto. And what is the definition of a ghetto? It's where money goes out but does not come in. And where every single business in the community is owned outside the community. And none of the money stays within the community. There are only minimum wage jobs available in the community, and that money is siphoned out. And so they created an economic map of South Central Los Angeles reaching to Hollywood Boulevard in flame. And that is a week where we had helicopters in the air surrounding, saying, oh, it looks like another fire, Pete. Yeah, Bill, that's a fire. Sure looks like a fire. There's more smoke coming up over here. Endlessly. And we had a week where it could be a teach-in in America about what is going on here? Why is the city on fire? And what does it mean? Antonin Artaud describes gesturing through the flames as the most extreme gesture a human being can make. And again, being obsessed with the fire as the object, rather than dealing with the fire as part of a story, and a point in a narrative, a point in an unfolding narrative that has enormous historical resonance and also future. Because those fires are still burning. Those fires on Crenshaw Boulevard are still burning. Those fires have not been extinguished in this city. And that is an ongoing story, but now that the fire is gone, you don't read the story. And so for me, again, it's this not looking at just objects, but realizing, reporting the Depression before we're in the Depression, and then, is figuring out, for me, one of the most important things is figuring out that things are coming. And I think that's one of the things that we do as artists. But I would love to see more in journalism is, predicting the future is not very difficult because the future has to do with the seeds that are being planted now. And so when you can see these are the seeds that are being planted, it's not a surprise that this is the future that results. And so for me, a lot of more journalism and arts on seeds instead of just trees. And just say, okay, what are the seeds that are being planted right now? Can we discuss that? And what is being seeded? It's not yet visible. But it's waiting to grow,
Victoria Martina, I do a lot of things. I write, and I'm also in the arts as a performer and writer. The thing, I've always been against journalism, even though I'm a writer, for the reason that I think it promotes a kind of disease, the kind of nightmare that Peter's been talking about, because I've always seen it as a kind of prurient form of voyeurism, because essentially the only things we can deal with in our lives are things that we encounter in reality. I think this kind of virtual situation, which is becoming worse and worse progressively, we're moving into what people have referred to as the information society, is actually distancing us more. The global concept is kind of paradox, because in reality, there's also a distancing effect that we think we know what's going on in the world, but as Peter said, we're getting these sort of sterile images, and we can do nothing about them. If we don't actually go and engage ourselves as individuals with the situations that we are encountering in our lives, it remains a kind of, I consider kind of voyeurism. And I was wondering if maybe the model should be shifted to what I would call preventive journalism, that would be like like what we should see in our healthcare system in the United States, which is the only developed country on the planet that doesn't look look after the health of its citizens and its inhabitants. So for me, America has to take the lead too, in a sense of responsibility. I mean, apropos bylines, I would say it has nothing to do with marketing or any of those things. Maybe I'm not Phyllis, but to me, the issue of the byline is the issue of taking responsibility. That, as Peter said, there's no such thing as objectivity. So we have to engage with the reality of what we're doing and take responsibility for it. And I think that's the purpose of this whole panel, that it's moving towards a model of collective and individual responsibility so that there's a moral implication to everything. And I think, the arts have actually been engaged in that, and journalism should be, it all should be together. So the idea of preventive journalism, I think, would be to see what's coming, as Peter was saying. Look at the things look at the trends, try to see the trajectories, and engage people with that rather than just report on things in a sensationalist way, things that we can no longer, as individuals, deal with. I mean, like Mother Teresa said, it begins, being a missionary begins at home. You work with the people next door. Everyone doesn't have to rush to India to deal with one community of lepers. You work where you are. So even that concept that we have to release this kind of glamorous, as you said too, glamorous idea that we're going to go to the ends of the earth and we're going to do this or that, or we're going to send money which we may never arrive at. But rather that we work where we are.
I can see Sasha already saying at the next post, what is this preventative journalism movement, right?
Yeah. And you're on it.
I have just one thing I want to say about the information aspect of this, because I think we are at this glorious dawn right now of interactivity with media. I think that this is going to actually be the disruptive force that's going to be so epic. It's going to change everything. I really feel that. And I was just in Chicago at a Maker event, and in the headline on the Christian Science Monitor, it was when the financial fallout was coming, and it said, "The hands-off era is over." Talking about deregulation and that whole thing. But every piece of this is the hands-off era is over, that we are all personally empowered now to weigh in on all of these things and to provide a preventative view of what that next piece is coming. I think that, if you think of indulge me for just a minute of what a disruptive technology might look like in this model. You get up every morning and you look at the news that is learning from how you look at the news every day. You pick those pieces that are important to you and you put them onto your news page. People can go and see your own newspaper that you create every day that has the Topeka news, and it has the New York Times news, and it has international news of what's personally important to you. And it provides a newspaper for somebody in Topeka that's better than anything that they can get anywhere along the way. And as part of that, you're able to comment on it, and you're able to put in your own content that you write yourself. And as part of this disruptive technology, it's a two-way path. There is all the newspapers that are providing the information that are able to see this flow back through the system, see how people are reacting to it, and where it's going next before it gets there. Know what I mean?
Playing on that a little bit, and also on the idea of the byline as responsibility, the word that occurred to me just before you said that was accountability. And I think we've all seen what happens when anonymity is part of the model in terms of opening things up. It's not a very pleasant picture. But when you have even a sort of, it doesn't have to be your name and social security number, but when you have even a semblance of identity attached to whatever it is that you're doing, whether it's your assembled newspaper or your remix of the Darfur materials, people take pride in, this is what I did with this. And so I do think that as we talk about an engaged journalism, what has to be built into that model is a reflection of, this is mine and this is who I am. And so other people who are contributing to that can then add their own perspective, but they have a clear understanding of what your perspective is. And YouTube is a great example of how that model can really foster creativity, and a lot of it is, is a waste of time, but not for the people who are involved. And you get to see, how that subjectivity gets constructed in the public space. So I think the byline is really crucial. I think it's more crucial than ever.
Yeah, I guess my thing with the byline, though, is more about somebody willing to give up final say. Yeah, there's the entire idea that this is the word. And not
stamp.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why, people like, run folks who are very, very apprehensive about engaging the audience that way. They don't want to be questioned. And that's what's really, that's been.
I mean, as bloggers, we know newspapers look down on us. I think that there's going to be a change in that too. If there's a path of a name attached to it, a chain of things that you've done with some kind of a engine to say that this is good, bad, or otherwise, that will change.
But doesn't introduce, that's this thing, is, bloggers are all these fresh voices and that are coming onto the scene, and it's not, the same Tom Cruise all the time. That's what people are scared shitless about this stuff, is because, Tom Cruise is getting his ankles cut out from underneath, and piece by piece, a little bit of, as he goes up the list. So that's, I don't know, we've never thought of blogs as being, I've always encouraged people not to think of blogs or bloggers as something, but just more as tools.
Most reporters on television and newspaper blog now. They blog incessantly, and I think some of these slow journalism goals are being accomplished because the people who are watching and reading them interact with them. And they influence, how they continue to cover a story. So I don't know that newspapers are so afraid of bloggers out there. They're engaging in it big time, and I think it does affect how the media covers what they're covering.
Right. I think this is the dawn of this extremely exciting piece of it. I think that we're just starting to see the very edges of it. Used to be letters to the editor, and now it's really becoming a two-way conversation. But I think that we've yet to see a technology that's so disruptive, that's so balanced on each side, of being able to remix the information back and forth and create your own product out of it. I think that that's going to be the thing that's going to be really dramatic.
Selma Holo from USC. Just the byline thing is really interesting to me because speaking from the position of museums, and Julie will probably support this, for so many years we had our big labels on the walls without any name attached to it. So you would learn what you needed to learn about a show or a particular artist by this unnamed, godlike kind of message that came to you, and you simply, that was what you learned, and it was really sort of the voice from above. There's a kind of a tendency, which will go nowhere probably, to have these labels signed, these big wall labels, because then somebody takes responsibility. Back to the responsibility thing. Someone says, this is my opinion about what Michelangelo was trying to say or do, instead of making it some big, broad kind of. So it's a funny thing. There's ego, and then there's sort of authoritarianness, and somehow or another, the signature can say, this is my idea, this is what I think. You can think something else, but I am going to give you some either information or opinions, and I'm standing by it. Right. So, just
yeah. The other thing too with the byline stuff is that Eric. I'm going to pick on Eric because I go way back. How many times we were using conventional style? Would your name appear on nytimes.com?
Probably never.
No, but in reality, if we were to use like the movie format where your name runs, everybody's name appears at the end. There are so many people that work at the New York Times that are involved in the final product that just one person's name being out there is very disingenuous.
It's very unfair.
Yeah. Eric has been there, I know 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning, even later, just running the entire thing. And I'm sure you guys have never, you guys have ever, Eric. But there's so many people behind the scenes like that, that shouldn't, they shouldn't be hidden. So, there are people that make a piece.
But there's a cost of transaction. If there's no cost of transaction, and a byline is a cost of transaction, when there's no cost involved to it, then you get spam. And when you have these comment things underneath posts, and and anybody can get up on them, then it just degenerates to the lowest common denominator. But if you say, anybody's free to post here, anybody's free to participate, but the cost of admission is having something important to add to the conversation. If you don't, then you don't get in. The problem is who decides what's the we had somebody way in the back there who had their hand up several times. Yeah.
I'm Mark Hazley. I freelance in a couple of different media. I'm a little behind here. I was just going to say in the byline, I grew up in an era in which Time magazine was reporting on the Vietnam War with unbylined reporters who were having their copy heavily censored and indeed rewritten on the main desk back in New York. And of course the rewrite was that the war was being won and don't worry, be happy. When I think about no bylines and someone said that's the anonymity factor, I always think about that. Even if the person whose name is on the piece has, been helped or mutated perhaps by the folks on the desk. I think all of us who've worked in the trenches for Deadline or even monthly journalism have that experience. At least you got someone to start with when you want to holler at them, right? And I think that's the basic point of a byline. And if you are a reporter for a paper and the desk is savaging your stuff to make it look like something that you didn't say or the opposite of it's happened to me a couple times, you can take a hike, you can post a notice on the web. So I tend to be pro-bylines, and I don't think ego has that much to do with it. I think it is, as you say, accountability.
What about bylines on?
Yeah, I want to talk about this. So, in my work, we talk a lot about food systems. People familiar with that term, a food system? So, processing, distribution, production, then consumption. I think of it also including sewage handling. It's the whole thing. And I wonder if we thought some about information systems, sort of how information flows through our communities, whether there might be some insight. I think we might have gotten a little sidetracked thinking just about bylines, because bylines could mean many different things to us. To me, this is very much a conversation about who knowing and trusting. And if you look at ad campaigns for people who share information, it's a lot about saying, you trust us, which is why you listen to us. And it's also about accumulating and consolidating power versus dispersing power. So in our current food system right now, if you go to a typical place where you can buy food, you inevitably are buying food from a very, very, very small number of corporations. And if you look at what our work is to do, it's to take that power and that knowledge and redistribute it to make what would be seen as very inefficient systems from an economic standpoint, but systems that duplicate. So there are many farmers markets. There are many people arriving at them. They're leaving. There are many small farmers. Maybe inefficient, but it's also incredibly stable by all different other measures. And it also builds community in this different way than having all of the food channeled through one or two conduits. And I wonder if we could, and it also gives you the opportunity to know the person who grows your food, which has some power, I think, to it. Pleasure, but also power, also some environmental and ethical questions linked up to it that get answered. And I wonder if there's a way to, with news or information, play the same game, where you take that big, thick stream of information where all of the power is consolidated and break it apart. And I think what you're talking about is this inflection point where we can disturb that system, but not have it become anonymous because its power is actually being personal. So I read a blog on food systems by a guy named Tom Philpott. I know Tom. I believe that he spends a lot more time keeping on top of what's happening in the world of food politics in a particular region than I do, and I trust his opinion. And so I go to Tom, not just to what the big media outlets say about food, to understand more of what's happening in the world. And so I think that that combination of recognition and trust with a dispersal of power is really what we're talking about.
What you're actually describing is the internet.
Exactly.
Because in the traditional sense, you have this pipe, and there are these choke points. There are these power points through which everything has to be gathered and then dispersed in some sort of way. But the internet is built on this idea that there is no choke point, that it goes through all sorts of nodes. So essentially nobody can really control it. I mean, we know there are threats to being able to control how information moves, but the sort of philosophical underpinning of the internet is this idea of its nodes through which there are no main highways. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to plug in all sorts of ways that we have traditionally done things because they were more efficient or because physically it had to be set up that way. And try to adapt that to this idea of the internet, which has become incredibly powerful. So the news business, where it was those traditional choke points and dispersal, what if you used the internet idea and it was this dispersal of power? It's a very difficult transition to make, just as it is with food.
And you asked two really good questions. One was the first question, which is this harder or not? And I think the reason it's harder is because the reason everything's hard, which is our own selves, our egos, letting go of being the one. That's really hard. It's really hard if you're in the business of selling something and you're relying on advertisers. Then it's really hard to say we're not the one because you're out of business. Then the other question you asked was to Peter, and he wouldn't even let you finish it, which was
I'm still mad about that.
We'll duke it out over tomorrow.
This question about subjectivity and objectivity, essentially, and the gobbledygook that might ensue if all sources were equal. So in the Mississippi Delta, when the river overflows the levee, it's all flooded at once. You don't have a channel anymore. And this question about how can there be a sorting mechanism so that you can know, like at a farm, I think the farmer's market's a great example. There's almost a sort of certification around food that if a farmer is willing to invite you to check out his farm and walk around it with him, he's not doing anything too naughty there, right? So there's this kind of openness thing that helps sort. But there might be other things that are more particular to media to say, well, why do you trust this person? There's a lot of BS on YouTube. There's a lot of BS on blogs. How do you know where to go? And that's something I'm really interested in. Mr. Jalopy, you're talking about this inflection point, spreading power. How do these things self-sort?
Well, I think that individuals are incredibly good judges. And it's like the open source thing of all bugs are shallow with a million eyes on it. If somebody does a bullshit art review that doesn't make any sense, if you get a million eyes on it, that review is a lot less important when everybody has a say in it. So if there's a mechanism, and if you look at like a lot of the things that are considered big Web 2.0 companies right now, there's this big shift to Dig and Technorati and all of these Yahoo BuzzUp and all these different technologies that let you vote this stuff up and float the best stuff to the top. The system can be gamed and it's not perfect, but I think that is what's, it can be in pure readers, it can be in opinions that are, voting up or down on it. But I think that's going to be a big part of it. I think that Wikipedia did an incredibly brilliant thing that was incredibly successful that a lot of people don't even know that's there. There's a tab, you read the Wikipedia entry, there's a tab of ugly fighting of everybody that has contributed to that article and track what everybody added to it along the way and all the arguments that they've had. And it's not anonymous. It's by an individual. You can see who went and mucked it up. But you're able to use Wikipedia purely as a resource, too. So I think that there need to be these levels to it of how deep it gets. There's this, and I think that, I think this is going to be another one of the disruptive things of, back to the original thing of slow journalism of bigger, longer, greater pieces. There's this encyclopedia of life that they're launching. That's this biological tool where they want to identify every living thing in the world and that everybody adds to it. And it has this incredibly simple slider of the level of detail that you want. So that you hit the page first and it has a pretty brief synopsis and it just gets deeper and deeper. And maybe as it gets deeper and deeper, it gets you more into that ugliness of all the people that are arguing about it. and everybody's able to engage in it at that level that makes sense to them.
You also though have this interesting idea about objects which contain aspects of the people who have touched them, who have mediated them in some way.
Yeah, well.
I mean, is it the same thing?
Yeah, well, it was really moving, Peter, when you were talking about this. I had a tear in my eye when you were talking about the narrative of objects, because this is something that means a lot to me. You know, I make all of my stuff out of found objects for the most part, partly because I'm cheap, but more than that, it's because it's these objects that I find at garage sales where the soul has been disrupted. The narrative in the family, they've stopped caring about it. And you pick it up, and these things are imbued with the sparks off the life of the wear of their hands and the way that these things have existed in their lives. And you create something new out of 50 of these things. You've got the soul, the narrative of 50 of these objects coming together in this thing that is completely your vision and dream. I don't know what this has to do with it other than I feel strongly about it, and Peter feels strongly about it, and I like to talk about it, and it was moving to hear you talk about it.
My name is Chris Taylor, and I'm a documentary filmmaker. I guess you guys got to watch my documentary on Food in America. It occurs to me that one of the major crossovers between food and journalism is exactly this concept of byline. And it also seems to me, along the lines of what Josh is saying, that bylines are changing food in America. Totally changing food in America pretty good, because instead of having an aggregated product when you go into a supermarket and you have potatoes from 500 farmers across the country, none of whom have accountability for what they're selling to you, now you can, because you've seen these farmers basically on menus in nice restaurants, you can go to that same farmer at the farmer's market, buy that strawberry, or buy that peach, or buy that green that you know you can meet the farmer and know his byline. When you buy it, it's an incredibly important transaction for the consumer. It's really what is driving the whole organic food movement. It's why it's the most dynamic part of our agriculture sector right now. It's organics. And this concept of byline, I think, is really important in an economic sense, because it allows the consumer to have some food accountability in his transaction. I mean, the ultimate expression of the anonymous non-byline is the fact that 700 cows contribute to one hamburger at McDonald's. You think about that, that's the Time magazine metaphor from the 60s. You can see that consolidation of economic power has a lot to gain by anonymity and a lot to lose by having a byline. I'd vote for a byline any day.
And then when someone gets sick,
yeah,
it takes 20 days to figure out where it came from.
Spinach, you can't find, or the pepper,
yeah.
You can't find the reason why they got sick.
And that changes our minds. During the spinach scare, I was farming and I was selling spinach at a farmer's market. And we had spinach growing on a farm in Connecticut. We harvested it, we washed it, we brought it to the market. And during that Saturday morning, a dozen people said to us, "You're not supposed to be selling spinach." Now, what does that say about how we imagine the way materials move around the world, and also how we respond to journalism? That spinach is bad because on one spinach farm, someone shot in the spinach field. That's very strange. I mean, it says something really weird about what that consolidation does for us.
So I want to just follow with this just for a second, because what you're talking about is that food doesn't exist in a vacuum, that there's a narrative behind it which makes it more important, makes it more trustable, makes it more dependable in a way.
Or less if it's about narrative.
Or less, yeah. But basically, if you choose to engage with it, you're choosing it because you are engaging with that narrative in some way. You sign off on that narrative. Something that Laura said at the beginning when she asked about how would you cover the fires differently. You know, fires don't happen in a vacuum. When we have controversies in the art world where there's some sort of censorship or NEA scandal or something, the scandal part of it gets reported, everybody retreats to the polarized kind of sensibility of it. What is sort of, what kind of for me ties this all together is this sort of sense is that there is, in the kind of traditional sense here, of a vacuum in which things happen, and they don't. And that you cannot, if the time that you start reporting on a story happens when that story happens, you're already lost. Because the only way to really understand that story is that if you've identified that it's an important issue somewhere along, and you create a context for it, so that when something happens, the people who are your readers or your consumers or your audience, your community, they have a way of placing it within the context that you've been busy building over a period of time. Whether you're talking about food and where you get the food and where in the context that comes from. What's that story? The fires, if there are better ways of telling the story than just panning on the fires, the reader, the consumer ought to be able to have a way of putting that into context. And I think that in journalism we have not done a very good job of that. We almost take a pointillistic approach in the sense that, oh, one from here, one from there, whatever grabs our attention at that moment. But what we don't do is say, okay, these issues are really important. These are the things that connect a lot of things that are going on in the culture right now. These are the things that we should be paying attention to. We should be telling the story of copyright, of food, of whatever, through a whole series of stories where you take little pieces of it, and over time you understand the narrative and the context so that when there is that thing, like a fire, you understand why it happened and where, what the consequences are.